Hey everyone, welcome to the Cosmonaut build log, part 2. This is where I left off at the end of part 1. I'm now going to get back into it and continue the modding. I'm cutting out some mesh for the front top section of the case. This is Modrite aluminium hexagon mesh, and this mesh is bare. You can also get it painted black. It has large perforations, which I often prefer. I'm cutting it out with a pair of tin snips. I'm drilling some mounting holes in the panel that's going to sit above the mesh. So this is the hold down plate for the mesh. You might be able to see that this panel has a slight curve in it. I had to bend it by hand because the panel it's going to be mounted to also has a curve in it. I'm preparing the mesh for painting. I'm scuffing it back with a 3M Scotch-Brite pad, and I've now assembled the front top section of the case. Now there's a fair bit more work I need to do to this panel. Aside from preparing it for painting and doing the painting, I need to do some more work on the filler. You can see at the front here there's a gap underneath the hold down plate, and the end of the mesh is visible, which is ugly. So I'm definitely going to cover this up. I'm going to bring the filler up to the level of the hold down plate. Now I've bolted all of this together with M3 button head Allen key bolts, so it's a very easy way of doing things. It's easy to assemble and disassemble. It's also very strong and sturdy, and you can see I've bolted straight through the hold down plate, through the mesh, through the plastic, and out the other side. I'm starting to prepare some of the plastic panels ready to be airbrushed. Now before you start painting, whatever you're painting needs to be incredibly clean, and everybody has a different process for cleaning up before painting. What I'm doing here to begin with is cleaning these panels with warm soapy water. I'm starting on the top rear section of the case. All I'm going to do to this part of the case is replace the mesh and paint it. So I've cut out a piece of mesh and I'm in the process of measuring out a hold down plate for the mesh. I'm going back to work on the mid plate and motherboard tray. I had more of a think about the design and realized I wanted to improve the strength. So I've drilled a couple of holes in the side of the mid plate and I'm now tapping some M4 threads. These are going to be to attach the motherboard tray directly to the mid plate. I'm now working on the cable routing holes. I've decided to design this motherboard tray specifically for the Rampage 4 Extreme, because if you do your cable routing holes properly, they end up being specifically designed and placed for a particular motherboard. So if I wanted to use a different motherboard, I'd either have to modify these cable routing holes somehow or replace the motherboard tray. And the way I've designed things, the motherboard tray is actually going to be not too difficult to replace, so that would be the best option. I'm now just checking if the connectors fit through the holes. Obviously I want these holes to be as small as possible, so I'm only going to make them big enough so that I can thread the cables through. And that's it. This is the first panel that I've completed. So I'm now spraying it with an etch primer, and after that it will be ready for top coat. I'm now going to work on the inner steel panels of the case. This is something I've been wanting to talk about. It's also something I had a lot of comments about on the first part of the build log. A lot of people say that this case is difficult to work with, it's difficult to mod. And that's because all of the outer panels are plastic. And once you remove that plastic, which takes minutes, a lot of it is just clipped on, you're left with a steel box. There's very little you can do with a steel box in terms of aesthetics. It's very hard to get creative with when modding. Obviously you need to use the existing plastic, otherwise you're going to need to build a whole new case around the steel box. And working with plastic is a lot more difficult than working with metal when it comes to modding cases. You know, aluminium cases that have all been bolted and screwed together are just so easy to mod. You can easily cut it, change the shapes of all of the panels, build new panels. When it comes to changing the shape of plastic, the only real way you can do that is with fiberglass, and that's a whole different skill set. When modding plastic cases, you're definitely more restricted. In my opinion, it's more advanced. But there is ways of getting around this problem, and you'll see how I get around this problem with a lot of the mods I'm doing to this case. So what I'm doing here is expanding the radiator capacity in the top of the case from a 360mm radiator to a 480mm radiator. And if you're planning on installing a high-end build into this case, it's a really important mod because of the restricted radiator capacity in the Cosmos 2. Now this part of it is very straightforward. Working with the metal is very easy, but you need to ventilate the plastic section of the case that sits above this if you're going to do this mod. Now you can see what I've already done to that panel, but you have to remember that plastic panel has the fan controller, power button, reset button, so all of that will need to be relocated. So this is a substantial mod. I also need to make some cuts on the front panel. As I've mentioned, I'm planning on having the entire front panel transparent. I'm going to install 10mm clear acrylic. So I need to make sure that the inner steel panels of the case are not going to be visible through that acrylic. So I need to cut them all back and out of the way. I've now installed the plastic front panel and you can see that none of the steel panels are now visible. I also need to make some cuts in the existing motherboard tray for cable routing. So I've made the cuts and I started out by only cutting out what I needed to, but with the existing cable routing holes and the new cable routing holes cut amongst them, it just looked incredibly messy. There was sharp edges everywhere. So I decided to cut out a lot more than I needed to, particularly on the right hand side there. I've removed that entire section with all of the existing cable routing holes. And as well as cleaning things up, this will also mean that if I decide to change the motherboard later, because as I've mentioned, I've designed the new motherboard tray for the Asus Rampage 4 Extreme, it will mean that I don't have to go modifying the existing motherboard tray again. So I'm just doing a final test fit of the new motherboard tray just to make sure that I've cleared the cable routing holes. You can see what it looks like from around the back. I could really have cut out a bit more of the existing motherboard tray, but I decided to leave that section down the left hand side there as reinforcing because it has a couple of folds in it. It's a very strong section of the motherboard tray. The components have now arrived that I'm going to be installing into the case. So I have here 2 Bitspower D5 acrylic mod tops, 2 D5 black sparkle mod kits, 2 upgrade kit 250s, 2 XSPC multi-port EX240s, and a single XSPC EX480. I'm masking up the radiator fins because I'm actually going to be painting the radiators the same color that I'm painting the inner panels of the case, which is a metallic blue. It's also a good idea to mask up your radiator fins if you're going to be using them for test fitting and getting measurements, because it's obviously very easy to damage radiator fins. I'm now test fitting the 480mm radiator, and it turns out that there is something in the way of the installation. The threads at the top front of the case, which are actually for the bars that go on top of the Cosmos 2, are in the way of the installation. So I've had to change the shape of the radiator casing and also grind back the threads a little bit. I was actually thinking about removing the bars from the top and bottom of the case and doing something completely different. But because this mod is for CoolerMaster, and this is something you need to remember, instead of completely changing the design of the case, I'm trying to do mods that complement the design. And I think that the bars are an important part of the Cosmos design. They are on the Cosmos S, the Cosmos 1000, so I've decided to definitely keep the bars. So as you can see, I have all of the radiators masked up. I just need to do a bit of surface prep and cleaning before I can paint them. And you can see these multi-port radiators really give you a lot of options. And the reason I went for these is because once I do a build into this case, I actually plan on doing a parallel configuration between these two radiators. And that way I'm going to have a lot more tubing visible through the front of the case, and that's going to be a feature. I'm now test fitting the pump and res configs. I'm not installing pumps at this point because for now I'm only installing the pump and res configs for aesthetics. Now I'm not going to be able to use the upgrade kit 250s or the 250mm reservoirs because they come up too high. They're going to be hitting the 480mm radiator. So I'm going to have to cut them back to the 150mm reservoirs, which are, a lot smaller. And I'm a little bit disappointed about this because these pump and res configs are going to be a real feature with that transparent front panel. But in the top section of the front panel, I'm actually going to install the power and reset button, some temperature gauges. So, it's okay if they don't come up that high. So it works out well. I'm just taking a look at the different mounts I can use. There's a mount that comes with the upgrade kit, which is designed for mounting this config to a horizontal surface. and a mount that comes with the mod kit, which is designed for mounting this config to a vertical surface. I'm going to have to come back to that part of the mod. I'm now going back to work on all of the panels that are going to be airbrushed, because I only actually have about 4 or 5 hours before these panels are picked up to be airbrushed. Now, it was at this point in the mod that I really came under pressure. I didn't have much time. I was coming up on the completion date. I still had a lot of work to do. I was working, late into the night when the light was bad, so I didn't film as much of it as I wanted to. So you will start to see some gaps in the filming now, which I was very disappointed about because, I only did this for my subscribers, and obviously I wanted to show you the entire process. But I will fill in all of these gaps when we take a good look at the finished product. So I'm now using a scroll saw to make some cuts. Now, this is not really what a scroll saw is designed for. It's designed for far more detailed work, but I find it handy for making some quick cuts sometimes. I really should be using a bandsaw or something similar to do this kind of work, and I actually plan on purchasing a bandsaw coming up soon. What I'm cutting out here is the hold down plate for the mesh for the top rear section of the case. Now, originally I wasn't planning on modding the rear side panel. I was going to leave it as a large blank area for an airbrushing art piece. But when it came down to it, I just didn't want to leave a panel without mods. So I had a good look at the rear side panel, and I realized that there's a really easy mod that can be done. Once you remove the dust filter from the rear side panel, you'll see how easy this mod actually is. All of it can be done with a Dremel. There is a lot of cutting to do because you have to get through multiple layers. You have to get through the outer thin aluminium layer, and you need to be careful when cutting it because it is fairly delicate. Underneath that is thick plastic, and the plastic is a bit of a nightmare to cut because when you cut it, it melts, and bits of plastic go everywhere, and it loses its structure. So you have to make sure you don't heat it too much. Then there's a lot of horizontal cuts that also need to be made to cut out all of the plastic reinforcing. But it took around 10 minutes, and this mod is going to massively improve the ventilation through this side panel, because the ventilation through the stock side panels is not that great. And if you're planning on installing two 240mm radiators in the bottom of the Cosmos 2, more ventilation is definitely going to be beneficial. I mean, it almost always is going to be increased performance. So I've now glued the mesh into position. I just use clear epoxy to do that. And I'm now going back to work on the top front section of the case. This is one of the last panels that are actually going to be airbrushed that I still need to work on. As I mentioned, I wanted to build up the filler to the level of the hold down plate. So I've done the first layer. I'll probably need to do about another 10 layers to get a nice smooth surface to paint on. I'm now starting the painting, and as you can see, the first parts of the case I'm painting is the bars that go on the top and bottom of the case. I'm painting them in a Mazda Aquarius metallic blue. As some of you will know, I've been using spray cans for quite a while now for modding, and for ages I've been planning to set myself up with a proper spray system. So just before this mod, actually, I went out, I got myself a compressor, a spray gun, and I've set up a spray booth. Now, if you're planning on doing this, go into an air tools shop, tell them what you're going to be doing, and they'll give you the appropriate compressor. You need something that's going to push a large air volume consistently. And when it comes to spray guns, I suggest picking something small and compact, because you're only going to be painting small surface areas. You don't need something that's going to hold a large volume of paint. And if you choose a small gun, it's going to be a lot easier to maneuver, get into tight spots, which you're definitely going to be doing, and it's just a little bit easier to use. Now, if you're nervous about using a spray gun as opposed to spray cans, it is a lot easier to use a gun in every way. Spray cans are inconsistent. Every can is different. You have a different air to paint mixture. They're just different every time, and a spray gun is exactly the same every time, so you can actually get used to it. The finish is far more even. It's higher quality in every way. You can get a perfect finish, which I'm always very fussy about. The paints are far higher quality. I'm using high quality automotive paints here. They're more durable, scratch resistant, they last longer. You also have a massive range of paints and colors to choose from. When it comes to setting up a spray booth, it's not that critical as long as you're in a ventilated area and you take all of the necessary precautions against paint fumes. They're highly toxic. You need to be extremely careful. I'm in a highly ventilated area here, so I usually just spray wherever I want to, but I try to spray up against a piece of plastic that I've hung on the wall, and that's very close to the door, so the paint fumes just go straight out the door. I've just finished polishing the edges of most of the acrylic that I'm using in the mod, so I have here 2 pieces of 10mm clear acrylic that I'm using in the front panel, and I also have a piece of 10mm clear acrylic for the front side panel, which I'll talk more about shortly. There's one more section of this mod that I haven't yet started on, and that is the bottom compartment of the case. I need to replace the reinforcing that I've removed. I've removed all of the stock reinforcing for the midplate, and I'm going to replace it with 10mm smoked acrylic. I also need to do something about the lower compartment, and originally I didn't really want to blank it off. I had some other ideas in mind, but at this point in the mod I am running out of time, and the other ideas I had were fairly extensive and I just don't have the time to carry them out. Blanking off the lower compartment was certainly on my list of options, so that's what I'm going to do. So I'm now making the reinforcing. I'm cutting it out from 10mm smoked acrylic, and I'm basically just going to make 2 reinforcing pillars that I'm going to put on the back side underneath the motherboard tray, because that's where most of the weight is on the mid plate. And I'm going to bolt down through the mid plate into the top of the reinforcing and up from the bottom through the bottom panel. So you can see both of the pillars here. I've drilled holes in both, and I'm now in the process of tapping M4 threads. The one that I'm currently working on, the larger one, is going to sit close to the middle of the case, and it's going to have 4 bolts, 2 in the top, 2 in the bottom. I'm going to use 30mm M4 button head Allen key bolts. The other one is going to sit at the front of the case. It's actually going to sit up against the front panel. Again, I'm going to have 4 bolts, but 1 in the top, 1 in the bottom, and 2 at the front. So in the top and bottom, I'm going to use 30mm M4s. In the front, I'm going to have to use between 5 and 8mm M4s. Strength is absolutely critical because I'm actually going to mount the rear blanking plate directly to this reinforcing. So I'm actually going to have to tap some threads into the front of this reinforcing also. So I'm just in the process of test fitting the rear blanking plate. And I'm actually also going to mount the radiators to the blanking plates. So there's going to be a fair bit of weight on this blanking plate. The front blanking plate I'm going to mount completely differently. I have a piece of angle at the bottom which I'm going to mount it to, and at the top I'm going to mount it directly to the mid plate. So I've now drilled all of the mounting holes in the blanking plates, and it's now time to cut out the ventilation. So you can see I have a couple of templates here. This one I use quite often. It's from the top of a BitPhoenix Prodigy, and I use it for marking out the mounting holes for a 240mm radiator. This one is from the bottom compartment of the Cosmos 2. It holds a couple of 120mm fans, and as you can see I've traced that pattern straight onto the blanking plates. So I spent a lot of time cutting all of this out with a jigsaw, and afterwards I realized that I didn't really like it. It just doesn't really suit this mod and what I'm trying to do with the internals of the case. Basically I want the internals of the case to be as subtle as possible. And the reason for that is I know that the externals are going to be very bright and eye-catching with all of the airbrushing. And when I install components into this case, I don't want anything inside the case that is going to detract from the components. Because the outside of the case is going to be bright and eye-catching enough, and obviously I want the components I install to be a feature. The water cooling system, I have a lot of ideas in mind which I'm going to talk about coming up. So I've built the panels again, and as you can see I've just gone for circles, which is going to be more subtle. It's also going to allow for more ventilation. And I'm going to install the fans on the outsides of the radiators, so they're going to be visible through these panels. And I've made the circles exactly the same size as the fan blades. The fans I'm using are Noise Blocker PL2s. So I'm spraying the panels with an etch primer. After this they'll be ready for top coat. Now I don't like using radiators with anything less than an M4 thread because I just find they're far too weak, they strip too easily. Most manufacturers use M3 threads on their radiators. Some use 632 threads, that's what these are. I much prefer an M4 thread, and Black Ice uses M4 threads. I think they're the only manufacturer. So what I'm doing here, I've drilled out all of the stock threads and I'm now tapping them out to M4. The other reason I'm doing this is because I much prefer the look of the M4 bolts that I have. The 632 bolts that come with these radiators are going to look ugly in this build. So the bolts I'm actually going to use are M4 button head Allen key bolts. Okay, I've now drilled out the last of the rivets and I've stripped down the case to the individual panels. There's a number of reasons I've done this. And it's not just for the painting. You don't really need to do this to paint. If I had a new case and if all I was doing to it was a custom paint job, I wouldn't strip it down like this. So the first reason is there's a number of mods I still need to do to these panels which I couldn't do when the case was assembled. So I need to drill some holes, I need to make some cuts in the mid plate, and it was just too tight to get the power tools in to be able to do that. It's also going to be a lot easier to prepare and clean the surfaces ready for painting, and it is a lot easier to paint. You know, getting up into those tight spots in cases, sometimes you just can't get enough paint up there and there's bare spots left behind. If you take a look in a lot of cases, up in the tight spots, you will see, you know, bare spots. You will see the metal through the paint. So you can get a far more even and more high quality paint job by stripping down the case, and it literally took 5 minutes to drill out the rivets and strip down the case like this. And it will probably take 10 minutes to put it back together with a rivet gun and some rivets. So it's definitely worth it. Now after I stripped down the case, I spent nearly the next 2 whole days just doing surface prep. And the reason the surface prep took so long was because the case was really banged around. It was banged around to begin with because it was second hand, but also during my modding, you know, not just scratches that you just can't avoid. I mean, during heavy modding, you're test fitting, you get scratches here and there, but it's more the cuts that you make, the holes that you drill, all of that needs to be filed back, you know, all of those sharp edges need to be cleaned up, and then you need to sand everything back. The surface needs to be absolutely perfect before you paint it. The main thing is that it's perfectly level. So, for example, scratches that go all the way back to the metal, they need to be sanded so that they're level, which means the entire area needs to be sanded back to the metal. And, you know, if you make any mistakes when you're doing this, if you're slack about it, it might seem okay to begin with, but when you finish painting, you're seriously going to regret it because you can see it from a mile away. And, you know, you end up putting all of this effort into painting, but if you haven't done that surface prep, none of it matters. The other thing, it's probably even more critical than getting a good surface, is cleaning up. There needs to be absolutely no particles, no oils, nothing on the surface before you start painting. Otherwise, you could end up having reactions, you know, the paint doesn't take properly, it cracks and peels later on. And if there's particles, you can also see them from a mile away. So everyone has different techniques for cleaning up, and I suggest you just ask wherever you're buying your paint from, ask them how to, you know, what products to use to clean the surface. Once I've finished all of my surface prep and cleaning, I hang the panels up ready to be painted. I then blow out the area with a compressor. For this, you'll need a tool to put on the end of the hose. I blow out the area with high pressure. I then wait about 30 minutes or so for the dust to settle. I come back and then I blow off the panels that I'm just about to paint with fairly high pressure to make sure that there's no loose particles on them. So the painting took me nearly 4 hours, and that's because I did almost everything in one hit. So I used 1 to 2 coats of etch primer on the bare metal. You don't need to use primer on the panels that have already been painted. I put 3 to 4, actually 5 coats of top coat on everything. And because I'm using a metallic paint, I also had to use a clear coat. So I also put 4 to 5 coats of clear coat. So there is just a couple more panels I still need to paint. You can see I have some angle there that needs to be painted, and also this. Now, some of you will have already figured out what this is. I mentioned earlier how I wanted to mount the pump and res configs. So I've created this bracket, And this is going to allow me to mount the pump and res configs directly to the mid plate using the mount that comes with the mod kit, which is designed for mounting the configs to a vertical surface. At last, I have a bender for bending sheet metal. Now, I didn't actually film me using it in this build log, but you'll definitely see it coming up. It's now the night before I need to ship the Cosmonaut to PAX, and it's about 24 hours after I finished the painting. So the painting is all done, including the airbrushing. All of the panels have returned from being airbrushed, and I've also almost completed the modding. There's still a few more little things I need to do as I'm assembling the case. So I have all of the components laid out here ready to be assembled, the entire case and all of the components that I'm going to be installing. And the very last things I need to do is assemble the case and pack it up for shipping. So now you can start to see some of the airbrushing. I'm not going to talk about the airbrushing until I assemble the case, but I can definitely tell you that I'm really happy with the way it's turned out. So I've started to assemble the front panel. You can see I've installed the 10mm clear acrylic in the bottom section. And some of the things I still need to do, I need to drill some holes in the mid plate for the bracket for the pump and res configs. I also need to drill holes in the 10mm clear acrylic front side panel so that I can install the hinges. I also need to make a few little cuts. There is some other holes I need to drill. I'm assuming the assembly will take me probably 2 to 3 hours if everything goes smoothly. So it's time to get started. The Cosmonaut is now ready to be shipped to PAX. The assembly went very smoothly. It took a little over an hour, so less time than I expected. I did run into a few small problems, just some holes that I forgot to drill, but I was actually expecting a bit worse. And the reason for that is I didn't get enough time to do enough test fitting with this case mod. I would really have liked to have assembled the entire case before I even started the painting. And the reason for that is there is often things you overlook, mainly with a mod of this magnitude, because all of the mods I come up with in my head, and most of the time I come up with the mods after I've disassembled the case. So if you can imagine, you're sitting there looking at a bunch of case components and you have to imagine how they go back together, and then you have to imagine how they go back together with your mods. And not just that, but how they're going to look, how they're going to attach. And, you know, the reason it was such a challenge with this particular mod is because of how this case is designed. The plastic actually clips on mostly. You know, it does screw on in places, but it's mostly clips, and clips are difficult to deal with. They break easily. And a lot of the clips I actually removed in my modding. For example, the front top section of the case, I think I ended up removing 4 of the clips, so it's only attached in 2 places now, which is still enough, but that just gives you an idea of what you need to think about when you're modding and how you can end up making mistakes. How you deal with that, as I mentioned, is test fitting, but also by, you know, taking a lot of care with your measurements. And, you know, don't go making cuts, don't get started until you are very, very sure about something, because, you know, and until you've spent a lot of time thinking about it, because you really only have one chance with this. If you make a mistake, you need to buy a whole new case. So in the end, I was very happy that there was almost no problems with assembling the case. So the airbrushing, right from the beginning, I knew that I wanted a detailed paint job on this case. I knew that I wanted airbrushing. And the reason for that comes down to something that I've talked about previously in this build log, and that is there's 2 real reasons you mod. One is for the components you are going to install, and the other is purely for aesthetics. And I knew that because I was just doing a case mod, I was going to have to mod purely for aesthetics mostly. But I did decide to install some components so that I could mod 4 components a little bit. Because modding purely for aesthetics is, I find that far more challenging. If I actually installed a system into this case, I would find that a lot easier. So I wanted an edge, and the edge is the airbrushing. And as some of my older subscribers will know, I find it difficult trusting other people to uphold the level of quality that I want. people who have worked with me for a while, they know how I do things and the level of quality I want, so I can trust them. But bringing on somebody new, no offense to anybody who works for me in the future, but I will be looking over your shoulder and making sure you do the right thing. But I also knew that I had a lot of freedom with this mod. It's not exactly as if it's for a client, so I wasn't so concerned. Also because the person that I picked for the airbrushing, he is a friend, he's an artist. I've seen a lot of his work, and he does amazing work. So he was certainly the person for the job. And when I went to him in the beginning, I had so many different ideas, and I wanted to work with him closely to make sure he carried out all of these ideas. I wanted the case to be a piece of alien tech that had broken off an alien weapon and was floating through space. It had radiation and light coming from one side and melting and burning it, meteorite holes in it, melted plastic, fire streaming back because it was moving forwards, possibly into an atmosphere. And then from the back, I wanted the back in the dark and cold icicles, ice crystals, that kind of thing. And then meeting in the middle, and the effects of the heat on the cold, and alien armor. I also wanted an art piece somewhere with a black hole and galaxies and just so many details. And I realized that I was stifling creativity, because I know what it's like when you're the one who actually needs to create something and you have somebody else with all of these ideas. If they have that many ideas and they're that fussy about it, they really should be doing it themselves, because when you create something, most of it needs to be coming from you. So I decided to leave most of it up to him, and I just said alien armor and an art piece on the back panel with a black hole. So all of the colors the artist decided on, and I was expecting, this is not what I was expecting. I was expecting dark colors, still these kinds of patterns, for the alien armor, but blues, purples, blacks. But I really love the gold that he decided to go for. As soon as he mentioned gold, I said definitely, because it gives me so many ideas for the system I'm going to install for the water cooling loop. I can use a lot of gold components, have components, chromed, gold chrome. And that's all I'm actually going to mention about the ideas I have for the future system that's going into this, because I'm actually going to continue this build log coming up and install the system into this case. So there will be a full build log. But anyway, I'm so happy with what he's come up with, and considering I only gave the artist 3 days to do this airbrushing, and if you take a look at the detail, it's incredible that he achieved this in 3 days, and also came up with the ideas and the designs. One of the most challenging parts of the airbrushing was, for those of you who think you can just paint the case as a whole, it's certainly not that easy. I actually only gave the artist the plastic panels, so he couldn't assemble the case, look at the case as a whole and design his artwork. He's also never painted computers before, and he'd only ever seen the stock Cosmos 2 fully assembled and only photos of it. So he didn't know how this case was going to look once I'd completed my mods. And I just gave him a bunch of terrible looking black plastic panels, and he had to somehow get creative with them. I did map them out for him, but if you can imagine how you would design the artwork, you'd have to hold all of the panels up next to each other and somehow try to make all of the panels look like they'd been painted as a whole. So that's definitely a challenging part of this, and also a very important part. So looking at the front panel, you can see that I haven't installed the piece of 10mm clear acrylic in the top section of the front panel. The reason I left it out is because it doesn't really need to be installed. Nobody's going to be opening this front panel because the case is going to be on display. No one's going to be touching it. And even if they do, I think it's better that they can properly see inside of the case to see the internal mods. And also the main reason I haven't installed it is because I'd like to make all of the cuts in it before I install it. That acrylic is where I'm going to be installing the power and reset button and a bunch of other things, but I don't really know what I'm going to be installing there until I know what hardware I'm installing into the case. I'm also not going to include the 10mm acrylic front side panel. The reason for that is it's about 7 kilograms in weight, so it's going to add a lot of unnecessary weight to the case for shipping. And it's only going to get in the way anyway. I think they'll probably just remove it so that people can properly see inside of the case. So now looking around the back of the case, the rear side panel mesh is a mod that I highly recommend for the Cosmos 2, because it's one of those mods that you put very little effort into and it has a massive payoff. This is literally a 10-minute mod. I'm so used to doing mods that take days on end and you get almost nothing out of. For example, a lot of the mods I did in this case that took the most time were more for the internal construction than anything else. And you can see a lot of that from back here. So looking at the motherboard tray, the new motherboard tray and the existing motherboard tray, you can see how all of this goes together. Now for the construction, I used rivets mostly, but where I modified the case, I've used M3 and M4 button head Allen key bolts. So you can see that after I disassembled the case, after I broke it down to the individual panels, I still did a lot of work on these panels. And actually the mid plate I've cut the entire center out of so that it's transparent, so that the 10mm smoked acrylic that I've installed on top of the mid plate is transparent, and eventually I'll install some lighting down the bottom there so you can actually see what's in the bottom compartment. So this panel here, the radiator, is obviously mounted to it, and it is mounted onto the acrylic. I have already talked about this. So that acrylic serves two purposes. It's a mounting point for that panel, and it also reinforces the mid plate. So that acrylic is extremely important, and I put a lot of time into making that as strong as I possibly could. As I mentioned, I used 30mm bolts in the top and bottom of it. You can see two M4s there at the front of the new motherboard tray. They actually bolt straight into the side of the 10mm smoked acrylic mid plate. So they were the threads I tapped in the side of the mid plate. This angle plate I had to put up here because it's the only place that the new motherboard tray is attached at the front of the case. Now I'd like to give you a far more detailed look at the construction of the case. I'd like to actually remove some of the plastic panels and give you a look at more of the behind the scenes mods. I'm going to do that in the next part of the build log. I'm just kind of skimming over the surface here because I didn't get much footage at this point. I really needed to get the case packed up for shipping. This is probably my favorite angle of the case mod, and it's because of a combination of the airbrushing up here and also the fact that you get to see all three of the different colors, the blue, the gold, and the silver. And the fact that we decided to leave the aluminium bare, which I'm really happy with. I used the coarse grit sandpaper on it. I think I took it back to about 220 grit in the end because I knew that I wanted the effect of the brushing. Now I've included a whole lot of photos at the end of this video because the camera wasn't picking up the colors or the finishes properly. The blue almost looks like it has a matte finish, but it definitely doesn't. It has 5 coats of clear coat. It has a gloss finish. The camera also wasn't picking up the metallic properly, and also wasn't picking up how bright and how high gloss the gold is. So hopefully the photos give you a better idea of what it actually looks like. So I'm now packing up the case for shipping. I've actually made a video on how I pack up my systems for shipping. I'll put a link on the screen. After I made that video, I had a lot of people ask me, do I pack up my systems like that every time, no matter what kind of a system it is? And I certainly do. You can see here, even though this is an empty case, which is the quarter of the weight of a completed, high-end water-cooled system, I've still gone to the same extent. I've supported the internal components, even though it's just pump and res configs with foam. I've surrounded the entire case with 50mm foam. I've then put it inside the original Cosmos 2 box, the cardboard box. I've then built a 5mm ply box around that and reinforced all of the edges and corners with 50mm aluminium angle, and I've then surrounded that with 30 layers of bubble wrap. At this point, I don't know when I'll be continuing this build log. Hopefully I'll get some time within the next few months. I just have so many client builds lined up at the moment, and I didn't get much notice with this project. When I took it on, I couldn't really allocate time for it, so now I'm behind with other builds. So I'll build a system into this case as soon as I possibly can. I'm really enthusiastic about it. I have so many ideas, so it's definitely coming up. That sums up this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and favorite if you want to see more.